Cold sweat dripped down Crosby's neck, pooling in the collar of his grease-stained jumpsuit. He hadn't meant to intrude on a royal deathbed. He definitely hadn't meant to trip over a bundle of pneumatic cables and slam his bare, calloused hand against the dying sovereign's chest. For 3 seconds, the sterile medical bay went dead silent. Everyone waited for the human to be atomized by the royal guard. Instead, the flatlining monitors shrieked back to life, and her sunken chest heaved. Fluorescent lights hummed a specific, grating frequency that dug right behind Crosby's left eye. He jammed the edge of his flathead screwdriver into the rusted seam of the ventilation grate, twisting until the metal popped with a sound like a fractured bone. It was too hot up here. The crawl space above the primary medical wing was designed for environmental drones, not a human pushing 200 pounds, and definitely not a human whose lower back screamed every time he shifted his weight. Down below, separated only by a thin layer of reinforced polymer grating, royalty was dying. Crosby wiped a streak of grease from his forehead with the back of his heavy canvas glove. He peered through the diamond-shaped gaps in the grating. The medical bay was massive, an expanse of cold, blue-white light that smelled intensely of ozone and something sharp, like distilled bleach. There were no beds, only a central suspension field where Princess Gaynor lay suspended, held aloft by anti-gravity nodes that pulsed with a rhythm, mimicking a healthy heartbeat. Except the pulses were getting slower. Crosby didn't care much for galactic politics. Humans had only been granted access to the core worlds 3 decades ago, primarily because humanity possessed a bizarre tolerance for manual labor in hazardous environments. They were the galaxy's plumbers, the folks you called when the hyperdrive conduit needed scrubbing, and you didn't want to expose your own fragile biology to radiation. Crosby was just trying to finish his shift, fix the dampening filter that was causing a rattle in the air supply, and get back to his quarters for a synthetic steak that tasted like salted cardboard. But he couldn't help watching. Around the suspension field stood a half-dozen figures clad in flowing garments that looked more like liquid mercury than fabric. Among them was King Arian. Even from this angle, Crosby could see the heavy, unnatural slump of the monarch's shoulders. Arian was a towering figure, his skin a pale, almost translucent ivory, mapped with faint, glowing veins that normally pulsed violet. Right now, those veins were a dull, sickly grey. Gaynor looked worse. Her biology was failing. The alien physicians, moving with frantic, jerky motions, were swapping out fluid lines and adjusting frequencies on large, floating obelisks. They communicated in low, harmonic hums that Crosby's standard-issue translator earpiece rendered into flat, emotionless English. "Cellular degradation at 80%, the earpiece buzzed, the voice devoid of the sheer panic evident in the physician's erratic hand movements. "Neurological pathways are fraying. We cannot stabilize the core temperature." Crosby shifted his weight. His left knee popped loudly, a sound that seemed to echo in the cramped ductwork. He froze, holding his breath, waiting for a royal guard to look up and blast a hole through the ceiling. Nothing happened. The occupants of the room were entirely consumed by the tragedy unfolding on the suspension field. He looked back down at the dampening filter in his hands. It was a stupid, mundane piece of machinery. A fan belt, essentially. He just needed to slot it over the primary rotor, lock the tension bolts, and crawl backward for 40 yards. He tasted stale coffee and copper in the back of his mouth. He was thirsty. "Prepare the final rites," Arian's voice came through the translator. It was a heavy sound, devoid of the harmonic musicality the species usually possessed. It sounded like stones grinding together. "Let her pass without the machinery." Crosby paused his work. He looked through the grate again. The physicians were slowly stepping back. They were giving up. A tight knot formed in Crosby's chest. He remembered a hospital room back on Earth, decades ago, smelling of cheap sanitizer and wilting flowers. He remembered the long, unbroken tone of a heart monitor, the way his mother's hand had felt cooling in his grip. It was a profoundly useless, human feeling of empathy welling up in his chest. He pushed it down violently. This wasn't his people. This wasn't his problem. This was a job that paid 50 credits an hour, and he was currently wasting time. He reached into his tool belt, his thick, calloused fingers blindly searching for the tension wrench. He needed to get this done. The air in the vent was growing stagnant, the scrubber failing to cycle the carbon dioxide out of his immediate vicinity. He pulled the wrench free, but the tool belt snagged on a jagged piece of the ductwork. Crosby tugged. The heavy leather belt pulled tight. He cursed under his breath, a short, sharp syllable, and yanked harder. The fabric tore. The heavy metal clasp of the belt gave way. Suddenly, his center of gravity shifted. He lurched forward, his hand slapping against the polymer grate to catch himself. The grate had been installed 40 years ago. It had endured countless micro-vibrations from the engines, temperature fluctuations, and now the sudden, desperate weight of a fully grown human male plunging downward. The 4 retaining screws at the corners of the grate didn't just snap. They sheared off completely with a sound like gunshots. Panic is not a sophisticated emotion. It does not allow for elegant solutions. When the floor beneath Crosby vanished, his stomach leaped into his throat. The grating fell away, spinning lazily toward the pristine white floor of the medical bay. Crosby followed a fraction of a second later, arms flailing, his wrench tumbling from his grip and clattering loudly against the duct wall before plummeting with him. Time dilated, stretching the 2-story fall into an excruciatingly long sequence of sensory inputs. He saw the faces of the Royal Guard turning upward. They wore helmets of polished chrome, featureless except for a vertical slit. He saw the way their hands, previously resting at their sides, snapped toward the plasma rifles slung over their shoulders. He heard the sharp, collective intake of breath from the physicians. He smelled the overwhelming, sterile scent of the medical bay, rushing up to meet him, cutting through the ozone and sweat of the ductwork. Below him, the suspension field holding Princess Gaynor wavered. The grating hit the floor first, shattering into 3 large, jagged pieces that skittered across the polished deck. The wrench hit a second later, bouncing off a medical obelisk and cracking its crystalline display. Crosby didn't have time to brace for impact. He didn't execute a perfect roll. He fell like a sack of wet cement. His boots slammed into the edge of a diagnostic console, crushing the delicate interface. The impact sent a shockwave of pain up his shins, blowing out his knees and sending his upper body pitching forward, directly toward the suspension field. "Intruder!" the translator barked in his ear. A massive understatement, given he was currently airborne and crashing through a sterile zone. He hit the floor hard, his left shoulder taking the brunt of the impact. The sound of his own collarbone cracking was loud enough to drown out the shouted orders of the Royal Guard. Pain, hot and immediate, flared across his chest and down his arm. He groaned, a guttural, pathetic sound, and tried to push himself up. The room was erupting into chaos. The guards were closing in, their weapons humming with lethal intent, a sound like a swarm of angry wasps. King Arian had physically thrown himself in front of the suspension field, his arms spread wide to shield his dying daughter from the crude, filthy creature that had just dropped from the ceiling. Crosby's vision swam. Black spots danced at the edges of his sight. He needed to show he wasn't a threat. He needed to raise his hands. He pushed off the floor with his right hand, but the deck was slick with some kind of medical coolant that had ruptured from the console he'd destroyed. His hand slipped. Gravity, having already ruined his day once, pulled him down again. He fell forward, crashing past Arian's outstretched robes. He scrambled for purchase, blindly reaching out to stop his face from meeting the deck a second time. His bare right hand found something. It wasn't the floor. It wasn't a piece of machinery. It was warm, yet terrifyingly fragile. Crosby's fingers clamped down in a desperate grip. He squeezed, using the object as leverage to arrest his fall. He ended up on his knees, panting heavily, sweat pouring down his face and stinging his eyes. His right shoulder burned from the awkward angle. He blinked the sweat away, trying to focus on what he was holding. His calloused, dirt-stained hand, covered in microscopic human biome, sweat and grease, was wrapped tightly around the bare forearm of Princess Gaina. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. It was a suffocating, heavy quiet, thicker than the air in the ventilation ducts. The hum of the medical machinery seemed to vanish. The buzzing of the plasma rifles stopped. Crosby stared at his hand. Gaina's arm was incredibly thin. Beneath his fingers, her skin felt like old parchment stretched over a frame of ice. There was a faint, sickly grey hue to her flesh, the same as her father's, but marred by dark, necrotic bruising where the cellular degradation was at its worst. He had touched her. He had bypassed the sterile field, ignored the quarantine protocols, and put his filthy, unwashed human hand directly on the dying heir to the sector. "Oh, hell," Crosby whispered. It was the only thing his brain could produce. He slowly looked up. 3 plasma rifle barrels were inches from his face, glowing with a terrible, contained heat that threatened to singe his eyebrows. Behind the rifles, the guard stood motionless, awaiting the order to fire. King Arian was staring at Crosby's hand, his expression unreadable through the alien features, but his rigid posture screamed absolute horror. The physicians were frozen, their hands hovering over their ruined consoles. Crosby knew he was a dead man. The penalty for merely entering a royal quarantine zone without clearance was severe. Physically assaulting a monarch, even accidentally, was an execution offense. He closed his eyes, expecting the blinding flash of plasma that would end his miserable existence. He hoped it would be quick. He hoped his meager savings would automatically route back to his sister on Mars. Seconds ticked by. The air conditioning hummed. A drop of sweat rolled down Crosby's nose and splashed onto the pristine floor. No flash came, no searing heat. Instead, a sound broke the silence. It wasn't a voice or a weapon. It was a low, rhythmic thumping. A steady, insistent beat. It was coming from the broken medical obelisk. Crosby opened one eye, half expecting it to be a trick. The plasma rifles were still there, but they had wavered. The guards holding them were no longer looking at him. They were looking past him, down at the suspension field. Crosby followed their gaze, still terrified to let go of the princess's arm, afraid that any sudden movement would trigger a nervous reflex from the guards. Beneath his fingers, something was happening. When he had first grabbed her, her skin had been freezing, devoid of any kinetic energy. Now, there was a faint, localized warmth blooming directly beneath his palm. It wasn't just heat. It was a microscopic vibration. Humans are walking biohazards. The average human body carries trillions of microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, viruses, a chaotic ecosystem that is constantly at war with itself, tempered only by a brutal, highly evolved immune system. Crosby, specifically, was covered in the grime of a lower-deck maintenance cycle. He was coated in salt, natural oils, and the ambient dust of 100 different cargo bays. The alien biology, by contrast, was highly ordered, delicate, and entirely unaccustomed to chaos. Their immune systems were engineered for perfection, designed to operate in flawlessly sterile environments. The rot that was killing Gaina was a localized failure of that perfection, a cascading shutdown of ordered cells that the body simply didn't know how to fight, because it lacked the aggression of a less evolved system. When Crosby's sweaty, dirty hand clamped onto her arm, a microscopic invasion occurred. Billions of foreign bacteria surged across the contact point. To a human, it was nothing. To Gaynor's failing biology, it was a biological shockwave. Crosby watched, entirely uncomprehending, as the dark, necrotic bruising on her forearm began to recede. It didn't just fade, it retreated violently, like oil fleeing from soap. The sickly grey of her skin flushed with a sudden, violent surge of violet blood. He could feel her pulse now. It was no longer the faint, sluggish thrum of a dying engine. It was rapid, hard, fighting back against the intrusion. Her body, previously shutting down in peaceful surrender to the rot, had suddenly been violently awakened by the perceived threat of human bacteria. Her dormant immune system, provoked by the sheer filth of Crosby's hand, roared to life, indiscriminately attacking everything foreign, including the necrotic cells. What is he doing?" one of the physicians stammered, the translator earpiece capturing the trembling disbelief in the alien's harmonic voice. Crosby tried to pull his hand away, his survival instinct finally kicking in. If he let go, maybe they'd just lock him up. "I'm sorry," he rasped, his voice sounding like sandpaper. "I slipped. The vent. Do not move," King Arian roared. The translation was loud enough to make Crosby wince. Arian stepped forward, pushing the barrels of the guards' rifles down with a swift, aggressive motion of his arm. He dropped to his knees, right beside Crosby, his massive, pale face inches from the human's. Crosby could smell the king's breath. It smelled like crushed mint and cold water. Arian wasn't looking at Crosby. He was staring at his daughter's arm. The color was spreading. The violet flush moved up her arm, past her elbow, surging toward her shoulder. The suspension field, reacting to the sudden increase in her body mass and kinetic energy, adjusted itself with a loud, mechanical hum, raising her slightly higher. Gaynor took a breath. It wasn't the shallow, rattling gasp of earlier. It was a deep, ragged intake of air that filled her lungs, expanding her chest violently. She let it out in a long, shuddering sigh. "Core temperature is rising," a physician whispered, hovering over a secondary console. It's spiking. 50 degrees. 60. The degradation, it's reversing. The cells are attacking the rot. Crosby felt a sudden, sharp pinch. He looked down. Gaynor's fingers, which had been limp and lifeless, were now curled tight. Her perfectly manicured, translucent nails were digging deeply into the thick fabric of Crosby's canvas glove, searching for the heat of his hand beneath it. She was clinging to him. "Hey," Crosby muttered, his heart hammering against his cracked collarbone. "Hey, you're crushing my hand." It was a ridiculous thing to say to a royal sovereign who had been dead 60 seconds ago, but Crosby was exhausted, in pain, and utterly confused. Gaynor's eyes snapped open. They were large, completely devoid of pupils, and a swirling, deep magenta. They fixed immediately on Crosby's face. There was no recognition in them, only the raw, animalistic panic of a creature abruptly pulled back from the void. She let out a sound, a high-pitched, harmonic keen that made Crosby's teeth ache. She arched her back, pulling harder on his arm. Crosby was forced to lean forward, his face hovering just inches above hers. He could see the intricate network of veins beneath her skin, glowing brighter by the second, pulsing furiously. "Sire!" The lead physician stepped forward cautiously, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "The human, his biology is contaminating the sterile field. The shock is causing a massive immune response. We must sever contact before her heart gives out." Arian slowly turned his head to look at the physician. The king's expression was a terrifying mix of desperate hope and absolute fury. Before her heart gives out? Her heart had stopped, Vale. Your machines were waiting for her to cool. Arian turned his heavy gaze back to Crosby. The king's eyes were practically burning. Human, Arian said, the translator dropping all harmonic pleasantries, rendering the voice as a flat, dangerous command. Do not break contact. My collarbone is broken, Crosby protested, gritting his teeth against the searing pain in his left shoulder. I can't hold this position forever. And respectfully, Your Majesty, I am extremely dirty. I haven't showered in 2 cycles. I do not care if you crawled out of a disposal chute, Arian said, leaning closer. Look at her. Crosby looked. Gaynor's breathing was stabilizing. The violent shaking in her limbs was subsiding, replaced by a steady, rhythmic tension. The dark bruises on her chest and neck were visibly fading, the necrotic tissue flaking away like dry ash, replaced by fresh, raw, violet skin beneath. The localized heat emanating from the point of contact between their hands had spread, encompassing her entire body. She was sweating. Aliens of her species didn't sweat. It was a crude, human biological response to overheating, a byproduct of the bacterial war currently raging in her bloodstream. She's burning up, Crosby said, his mechanical instincts kicking in. You're over-revving her engine. The fever is going to cook her brain if you don't vent the heat. The physicians gasped at the crude analogy. Arian didn't blink. What do you suggest, mechanic? Crosby swallowed hard. He looked around the sterile room, at the useless floating obelisks, and then down at the shivering, burning princess clutching his hand like a lifeline. He wasn't a doctor. He fixed pipes. But he understood pressure, and he understood failing systems. Get some ice, Crosby said, his voice flat. Or cold water, whatever you have. Pack it around her core. And for God's sake, turn down the ambient temperature in here. It feels like an oven. Arian didn't hesitate. He snapped his fingers, pointing at the guards. Fetch the thermal suppressants, now, and lower the bay temperature to 0 degrees. The guards, trained only for combat, scrambled awkwardly to comply, rushing toward the medical supply lockers. The temperature in the room plummeted almost instantly, a biting chill replacing the warm ozone. Crosby shivered, his sweat-soaked jumpsuit suddenly feeling like a layer of ice against his skin. But he didn't pull his hand away. Gaynor's grip remained iron-clad, her thumb pressing hard against the pulse point on his wrist. He stared at the pale, beautiful alien gasping for air beneath him, then looked up at the gaping hole in the ceiling where he belonged. He just wanted to go back to his bunk. But as the monitors around them began to chime with a steady, strong rhythm, Crosby realized with a sinking feeling in his gut that his shift wasn't going to end anytime soon. He had just kick-started the biology of a dying royal, and the galaxy was going to demand a warranty. The ambient temperature dropped so fast the moisture in the air crystallized, settling over the pristine surfaces of the medical bay like fine dust. Crosby's breath plumed in thick, white clouds. His teeth started clicking together. He couldn't stop them. The pain in his left shoulder had evolved from a sharp, electric stab into a deep, nauseating throb that radiated down his ribcage with every erratic beat of his heart. He was kneeling in a puddle of slick, spilled coolant, his right arm extended and locked in a death grip with a princess who was literally cooking herself from the inside out. The guards rushed back into the room, their heavy boots clanking against the deck. They carried armfuls of blue, gelatinous bricks, military-grade thermal suppressants. They didn't know how to handle a medical patient. They practically dumped the blocks onto the suspension field. "Careful, damn it!" Crosby barked, his voice cracking from the cold. "Pack them around her neck, her underarms, and her groin. That's where the major arteries are. You want to cool the blood, not just freeze her skin. The guards hesitated, looking toward King Arian. The monarch gave a curt, sharp nod. The physicians, previously paralyzed by the violation of their sterile protocols, finally surged forward. They pushed the guards aside, their long, multi-jointed fingers manipulating the gel bricks with practiced, albeit frantic, precision. When the blue gel touched Gaynor's burning, violet skin, the suppressants hissed loudly. A thick vapor smelling of liquid nitrogen and crushed peppermint flooded the air. The core temperature is still climbing. The lead physician, a tall, gaunt alien named Linus, shouted over the hissing steam. She is at 90 degrees human standard. Her synaptic fluid will boil. We must apply a systemic paralyzer to shut down the biological response. No! Crosby yelled, surprising himself with the volume. He didn't know anything about alien physiology, but he knew how combustion engines worked. He knew how pressure built up when a system was choked. If you paralyze her now, you kill the engine while the throttle is wide open. You'll trap the heat inside. Let her sweat it out. Linus turned his large, pupilless eyes toward Crosby, his face contorted in alien disgust. You are a mechanic, human. You are shedding millions of necrotic skin cells and toxic microbial life forms into a level 1 isolation ward. You are poisoning her. I'm saving her life, you overgrown glow stick, Crosby gritted out through chattering teeth. He shifted his weight, trying to relieve the pressure on his shattered collarbone. Black spots swam in his peripheral vision. He was going into shock. The poison, the dirt, it's giving her immune system something to punch. If you shut her down, the rot takes over again. Arian raised a massive hand, instantly silencing the physician. The king stepped closer, his heavy robes brushing against Crosby's knee. He looked down at the point where Crosby's grime-coated glove was still tightly clutched in Gaynor's delicate, sweating hand. He is right, Linus, Arian said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. The rot thrived in our perfection. Our bodies forgot how to wage war. This human, he is a walking battlefield. Let the war rage. Beneath Crosby's hand, Gaynor thrashed violently. The suspension field whined, struggling to compensate for her erratic movements. Her head whipped side to side, her deep magenta eyes wide and unseeing, tracking phantoms in the vapor. She began to mutter in her native tongue, a rapid, discordant series of clicks and harmonic hums that Crosby's standard-issue earpiece completely failed to translate. It just fed him a low, error-tone static. Her fingernails dug deeper into his palm, piercing the thick canvas of his glove. He felt a sharp prick, followed by the warm trickle of his own blood. Great, Crosby thought, his vision blurring. Now we're exchanging fluids. I'm going to catch space rabies. He watched the monitor on the remaining unbroken medical obelisk. He didn't know how to read the alien symbols, but he understood the universal language of graphs. A jagged, angry red line was spiking upward, plateauing, and then dipping slightly, only to spike again. It was a brutal tug-of-war. The heat radiating from her skin was incredible. Even with the ambient temperature in the room hovering near freezing, and the thermal gel blocks frosting over, the air directly above Gaynor was warping with heat haze. Crosby's right arm was sweating profusely inside his suit, while his left side was going completely numb from the cold. "Come on," Crosby whispered, his head dropping forward until his chin rested on his chest. He was too tired to hold it up. "Just break the fever. Just pop the clutch." For 10 excruciating minutes, the room existed in a state of violent, freezing stasis. The hissing of the gel, the panicked breathing of the princess, and the erratic chiming of the medical monitors blended into a deafening roar in Crosby's ears. Then the red line on the monitor peaked one last time, hit a ceiling, and plummeted. It didn't crash down to the flat line of death. It dropped rapidly, smoothly, settling into a steady, rhythmic sine wave that pulsed with a calm, glowing blue light. Gayna's back arched one final time, a massive breath tearing through her lungs. She exhaled slowly, her body going entirely limp against the suspension field. The violent, flushed violet color of her skin began to recede, leaving behind a healthy, pale ivory, the faint veins beneath pulsing with a steady, vibrant purple light. The crushing grip on Crosby's hand instantly vanished. Her fingers uncurled, sliding limply off his glove. "Core temperature is dropping," Linus whispered, staring at the console in absolute disbelief. "The degradation, the cellular decay has completely halted. The necrotic tissues have been purged. She is entering a restorative sleep cycle." A collective breath was released in the room. The guards lowered their weapons, the tension bleeding out of their rigid postures. King Arion fell to his knees beside the suspension field, bowing his massive head over his daughter's chest, his shoulders shaking with silent, heaving sobs. Crosby stared at his empty right hand. The canvas glove was soaked in sweat, alien coolant, and a few drops of his own red blood. The job was done. The system was stabilized. With the adrenaline suddenly evaporating from his bloodstream, the pain in his collarbone roared back to life with a vengeance, accompanied by the crushing exhaustion of a double shift and a 2-story fall. Crosby didn't say a word. He just let his eyes roll back, his center of gravity shifting backward as he collapsed onto the frozen deck, welcoming the dark. Crosby woke to the smell of intense, astringent citrus and the sensation of hundreds of tiny, biting insects swarming over his left shoulder. He gasped, his right hand shooting across his chest to swat at the bugs. His palm met a cold, smooth metal. He blinked his eyes open, squinting against blinding, shadowless white light. He was lying on a flat, rigid slab in a room devoid of corners. The architecture swooped and curved, seamless and completely sterile. He wasn't in his grease-stained jumpsuit anymore. He was naked, draped only in a thin, papery blue sheet that felt like woven plastic. Attached to his left shoulder was a bulky, metallic device shaped like a horseshoe crab. It hummed aggressively, and the insects he felt were microscopic kinetic drivers rapidly knitting his fractured collarbone back together. It didn't hurt exactly, but it itched with a ferocity that made him want to claw his own skin off. "Don't scratch it," a voice said. Crosby turned his head. Sitting on a sleek, floating chair near the foot of the slab was King Arion. The monarch was no longer wearing the liquid mercury robes of a grieving father. He was dressed in a sharp, high-collared military uniform of deep charcoal and silver. He looked rested, though the glowing veins on his face still pulsed with a muted, exhausted rhythm. "Where are my clothes?" Crosby asked. His throat was bone dry. His voice sounded like gravel grinding in a cement mixer. "Incinerated," Arion stated plainly. They were a biological hazard of the highest order. The amount of fungal spores, bacterial colonies, and localized toxins embedded in the fabric violated 7 distinct treaties regarding interspecies contact. Crosby groaned, letting his head fall back onto the slab. "My ID badge was in the breast pocket, and my union card. Do you know how hard it is to get a replacement union card from the guild? It takes 6 months. I'm going to lose my docking privileges." Arion stared at him. The human's reaction was entirely alien to the king. He had just altered the course of a galactic dynasty, saved the sole heir to a sector encompassing 4 billion souls, and he was complaining about a piece of plastic. "Your compensation will be adequate," Arion said, a hint of dry amusement coloring his deep voice. He gestured to a small recess in the wall. A metallic cylinder slid out and floated over to Crosby. It was filled with chilled, perfectly clear water. Crosby snatched it with his good right hand and drained it in 3 massive gulps. The water tasted like nothing, completely pure, stripped of the trace minerals he was used to. It didn't quench his thirst so much as wet his throat, but it helped. "How is she?" Crosby asked, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Alive," Arian said. The single word carried the weight of a dying star. "Sleeping. Her biology is exhausted. Dr. Linus is currently attempting to analyze the blood sample we extracted from your glove. He is deeply disturbed." "Yeah, well, I hadn't showered since Tuesday," Crosby muttered, eyeing the bone knitter on his shoulder. "How long does this thing take?" "Another hour," Arian replied. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The regal facade dropped slightly, revealing a father who had just stared into the abyss. "Dr. Linus calls you an infestation. He says your biology is chaotic, aggressive, and entirely devoid of elegance." "Linus sounds like a guy who's never had to snake a clogged plasma drain," Crosby retorted. "He says the bacteria you introduced to Gainer's system acted like a pack of starving predators," Arian continued, ignoring the comment. "Our immune systems are elegant. They are designed to identify anomalies and gently dismantle them. But the rot was a mutation of our own cells. Our bodies did not recognize it as an enemy. It just let the cells die." Arian looked down at his own pale hands. "Then you arrived. You brought billions of foreign organisms, crude, territorial, and violent. When they entered her bloodstream, her immune system did not have time to be elegant. It panicked. It triggered a primal, scorched earth response to eradicate your filth. In doing so, it incinerated the rot alongside it." Crosby sighed. He understood the mechanics of it. He had flushed enough irradiated cooling lines with harsh chemical solvents to know that sometimes you needed something highly toxic to burn out a blockage. "So, I'm a solvent," Crosby said cynically. "Glad I could help. Once my shoulder is done, point me to the nearest airlock, or a shuttle. I need to get back to the lower decks. If I miss my next shift, the foreman is going to dock my pay, union card or no union card." Arian stood up. He towered over the medical slab, casting a long shadow across Crosby's face. "You misunderstand your current position, Crosby Miller," Arian said smoothly. Crosby frowned. "You looked up my file. I am the sovereign of this sector. I know the designation of every rivet on this station," Arian replied. "You are not returning to the lower decks. The rot is not unique to my daughter. It is a genetic degradation affecting less than 1% of our population, but it is always fatal. We have spent centuries searching for a cure in sterile laboratories and synthesized proteins." Arian stepped closer, leaning over Crosby. "We were looking in the wrong place," the king whispered, his eyes locked onto Crosby's. "We did not need a sophisticated cure. We needed a sledgehammer. We needed chaos. We needed you." Crosby felt a cold knot form in his stomach, entirely unrelated to the chill of the room. He looked at the vast, powerful alien king, and suddenly felt very small and very trapped. "I'm a mechanic," Crosby repeated, his voice losing its cynical edge, replaced by a low, rising panic. "I fix air scrubbers. I don't do medicine." "You do now," Arian said. "Consider yourself drafted into royal service. Your hazard pay will be astronomical." The king turned and walked toward the seamless door. As it slid open, he paused and looked back over his shoulder. "And do not worry about showering, Mr. Miller," Arian added. "Your filth is now a matter of national security." Rough, woven fibers of a royal tunic chafed against Crosby's freshly mended collarbone. They had given him clothes that looked expensive, deep navy fabric with silver thread running through the seams, but the shirt felt stiff, smelling faintly of industrial lavender and distilled rain. It was an artificial cleanliness that made his skin itch. He sat on the edge of a floating divan that had no legs, his old, oil-stained work boots sitting on the floor beside him like a pair of dirty dogs in a cathedral. They hadn't burned the boots, at least. He'd fought the orderly for them, threatening to break his other collarbone until they relented. His quarters were massive, a curved vault of white polymer, and soft, indirect lighting that shifted from amber to pale blue, depending on the time of day. There were no handles on the doors. There were no buttons on the walls. Everything responded to proximity sensors or the low, authoritative hums of the royal staff who brought him food. The food was the worst part. It arrived on silver platters, shaped into perfect geometric cubes. Some of it was translucent and tasted like cold cucumber gel. Some was dense, grey, and reminded him of salted lard. He missed the grease of the lower deck mess halls. He missed the chemical burn of cheap synth coffee that could strip paint off a bulkhead. Here they gave him a tepid, herbal infusion that smelled like wet hay and did absolutely nothing to cure the dull headache thumping behind his eyes. A soft chime echoed through the walls, a sound like a wet finger rubbing the rim of a crystal glass. The wall split open, sliding back into itself with a pneumatic sigh. Princess Gaina stepped through the opening. She wasn't floating in a suspension field anymore. She walked on her own 2 feet, though her movements were cautious, her long, multi-jointed fingers lightly brushing the wall for balance. Her skin was a vibrant, healthy ivory now, the violet veins along her neck and jawline pulsing with a steady, quiet rhythm. She was dressed in a simple, loose-fitting white gown that trailed on the floor behind her. Crosby didn't stand up. He stayed on the divan, his hands resting on his knees, his knuckles scarred and dark with grease that no amount of royal soap seemed able to lift. "You look better," Crosby said. His voice was too loud for the quiet room. It bounced off the curved walls, sounding rough and unpolished. Gaina stopped a few paces away. Her large, pupil-less magenta eyes rolled slowly, taking him in from his uncombed hair down to his battered boots. "The physicians say I am entirely cured," she said. The translator around her neck rendered her voice into a soft, melodic alto, though Crosby could still hear the underlying harmonic clicks of her actual vocal cords beneath the electronic override. "They have spent 3 solar cycles searching my blood for remnants of the rot. There are none. Only your pieces." "My pieces?" Crosby let out a dry, hacking laugh. "You mean bacteria? Staph? E. coli? Probably a little bit of engine coolant and old sandwich crumbs. You're welcome." Gaynor didn't smile. Her species didn't have the facial muscles for it, their expressions governed instead by the tightening of the skin around their temples and the speed of the pulse in their veins. Right now, the violet light in her neck was scanning fast, a rapid, frantic flicker. "It is terrifying," she whispered, stepping closer. The scent of her came with her. Not the minty cold of the medical bay, but something older, like dry earth after a sudden downpour. To know that my life was saved by something so hostile. Dr. Linus showed me the magnification slides. Your blood, your skin. It is a civil war, Mr. Miller. How do you survive your own body? "We just do," Crosby said, leaning back against the rigid cushions. "Humanity didn't grow up in a sterile box, Princess. We grew up in the mud. We fought every bug, every virus, every rotten piece of meat on a dead planet, until our bodies learned how to hit back harder than the world could hit us. You guys, you engineered the struggle right out of your lives. You got so perfect that a stiff breeze could knock your whole dynasty over. She looked down at her hands, flexing her long fingers. Perhaps, but our perfection kept us alive for 10,000 years. Yeah, Crosby muttered, looking at his boots. Until it didn't. The internal contradiction of his situation was starting to grind on him. He was a prisoner here, make no mistake. The door only opened when they wanted it to. He was being treated like a savior, fed royal rations, and housed in a room that cost more than his father had made in a lifetime. But he couldn't leave. He was a biological weapon they were trying to turn into a syringe. He felt a sudden, sharp spike of anger at the king, at the physicians, at the broken vent that had dropped him into this mess. He wanted his wrench. He wanted the predictable, honest weight of iron in his hand, not this soft, floating purgatory. My father intends to use you, Gaynor said softly, breaking the silence. You know this. He can try, Crosby said, his jaw tightening. But I'm a mechanic, not an apothecary. You can't just squeeze me into a bottle and pour me over every sick lord in the sector. He does not wish to squeeze you, Mr. Miller, she said, her magenta eyes narrowing slightly as the veins on her temples darkened. He wishes to harvest you. Silver needles clicked against a tray as Linus adjusted his magnification lenses. The laboratory was adjacent to Crosby's quarters, separated by a thick sheet of transparent polymer that allowed King Arion to watch from an observation gallery above. The air in the lab was thick with the smell of ozone and burnt vinegar, the aftermath of Linus's repeated attempts to sterilize the equipment after Crosby breathed on it. "Hold still, human," Linus hissed, his multi-jointed fingers manipulating a long, hollow probe toward Crosby's forearm. Crosby didn't move, but his muscles were tense as iron wires. He sat on a cold metal stool, his shirt sleeve rolled up to the shoulder. His skin was pale under the harsh laboratory lights, covered in a map of old scars from rogue welding sparks and sharp sheet metal edges. "You've taken 6 vials already, Doc. If you drain me dry, the cure dies with the host. Isn't that basic biology?" "The samples are liquefying," Linus muttered, his voice tight with frustration. He didn't look at Crosby. His eyes were glued to a massive holographic display showing a cross-section of a human skin cell being attacked by alien synthetic antibodies. "Your microflora cannot survive in our nutrient mediums. The moment we isolate the specific bacterial strains from your sweat, they lose their aggression. They die within minutes. They require the host environment. They like me," Crosby said cynically. "I've got a nice, warm ecosystem going. 37 degrees. Plenty of salt, lots of stress. You can't replicate that in a glass dish." From the gallery above, King Arion's voice boomed through the intercom system. "Then we must bring the patient to the environment." The heavy door at the back of the laboratory hissed open. 2 guards marched in, their chrome helmets reflecting the blue glare of the holographic screens. Between them, suspended in a portable gravity harness, was a young boy. He couldn't have been more than 10 cycles old. His skin was already the terrible, mottled grey that Crosby recognized from Gaynor's deathbed. His head hung low, his thin neck unable to support the weight, his breathing a wet, rattling whistle that echoed painfully in the sterile room. "This is Arthur," Arion said over the intercom. The king's voice had lost its majestic weight. It sounded thin, desperate. "He is the son of my prime counselor. The rot reached his thoracic cavity this morning. The physicians give him 3 hours. Crosby looked from the boy to Linus, then up to the glass gallery where the king stood. His stomach dropped, turning over like a failing turbine. "No," Crosby said, his voice dropping to a low, hard register. "No way. I'm not a performing monkey. You can't just haul sick kids in here and expect me to rub my hands on them." Linus turned on him, his ivory face flushing a dark, angry purple. "You selfish, primitive creature. His life is ending. A single touch from your disgusting, unwashed flesh could halt the degradation. You have the cure living in your skin like lice, and you refuse. "It's not a cure," Crosby shouted, standing up from the stool so fast it clattered against the floor. He pointed a thick, trembling finger at the dying boy. "It's a biological shock. Do you know what I felt when your princess grabbed my hand? I felt her body burning up. I felt her heart nearly tearing itself out of her chest. It's a gamble, Linus. Her system was strong enough to survive the fever. This kid? Look at him. He's half dead already. If my bacteria hits his bloodstream, the shock might kill him before the rot does." The room went completely silent, except for the wet, rattling wheeze of the boy in the harness. Crosby breathed heavily, his chest heaving under the silver-stitched tunic. He felt dirty, not with the honest grime of the lower decks, but with the grease of a morality he hadn't asked to carry. He wasn't a doctor. He didn't have an oath. He was just a guy who had tripped over a wire, and now he was being asked to play God with a child's life based on a theory cooked up by an alien who thought soap was a religious text. The boy, Arthur, slowly lifted his head. His eyes were dull, the magenta color fading into a murky, sightless gray. He looked toward Crosby. He didn't know what a human was. He didn't know about the lower decks or the air scrubbers. He just saw a large, strange creature with a red face and calloused hands. Arthur reached out a single, trembling arm. His fingers were thin, the nails already blackening with necrotic rot. He didn't speak, but his small hand remained open, hovering in the cold air between them. Crosby stared at the hand. He remembered his sister's face when she had the lung rot on Mars, back when the terraforming filters failed in Sector 4. The company hadn't sent doctors. They'd sent inspectors to see if the filters were still under warranty. He had sat by her bed for 4 days, holding her hand, watching her skin turn that same dry, papery grey. She had survived, but only because our people were stubborn enough to live through the poison. He looked up at the gallery. King Arian was watching him, his massive hands gripping the silver railing so hard, the metal was groaning under the pressure. "If he dies," Crosby said, his voice cracking, "it's on your head, Arian, not mine." The king didn't answer. He just bowed his head. Crosby turned back to the boy. He took 3 steps forward, his heavy boots sounding like thunder in the quiet lab. He reached out his right hand, the hand that still carried the dried blood of the princess beneath his fingernails, the hand that had never known a day of royal luxury. He didn't hesitate this time. He didn't slip. He clamped his broad, warm palm over the boy's tiny, freezing forearm and held on tight. Contact was instantaneous, but the reaction was agonizingly slow. Arthur's skin felt like a frozen apple, tight, bruised, and carrying a terrifying lack of density. Crosby clamped his thick fingers around the boy's wrist, bracing his boots against the cold floor. He waited for the sudden burst of heat, for the violent, thrashing life he had felt with Gaynor. Nothing happened. The heavy, wet rattling in the boy's chest continued, each breath spaced further apart. The sickly grey hue of his face didn't change. "He's too far gone," Crosby murmured, his voice sounding hollow in the vast laboratory. He squeezed the small wrist tighter. He felt a profound, heavy sickness in his gut. It was the absolute helplessness of standing beside a broken machine that lacked the parts to be salvaged. "The cellular degradation is at 94%, Linus announced, his long fingers flying across a holographic interface. "His heart is failing. The human's biological markers are present, but Arthur's immune system is too weak to mount a defense. He is not fighting back." Up in the gallery, Arian slammed his fist against the reinforced glass. The dull thud echoed through the chamber. Crosby looked at the boy's sunken eyes. The murky grey irises were rolling backward. Arthur was simply slipping away, too exhausted to panic. The bacteria flooding his system wasn't waking him up. It was just another weight pulling him under. "Hey," Crosby barked, shaking the boy's arm roughly. "Hey, kid, wake up." Arthur's chin lolled against his chest. Panic, ugly and irrational, flared in Crosby's chest. He let go of the boy's wrist and grabbed him by both shoulders. He ignored the frantic, high-pitched alarms blaring from the medical harness. He ignored Linus shouting at him to step away. "Don't you quit!" Crosby snarled, leaning his face inches from Arthur's. He shook the boy hard, the violent motion snapping Arthur's head back. "Fight it, damn you! Get mad!" He dragged his right hand, rough with calluses and coated in the aggressive, invisible filth of 1,000 cargo holds, straight across Arthur's bare chest. He rubbed the skin hard, creating friction, deliberately scratching the boy's fragile epidermis with his blunt fingernails. He needed the bacteria to penetrate faster. He needed to trigger an alarm in the boy's dying brain. "Guards!" Linus screamed, misinterpreting the rough treatment for an assault. "Remove him!" The two royal guards stepped forward, raising the heavy butts of their plasma rifles to strike Crosby down. "Hold!" Arian's voice shattered the air through the intercom, loud enough to cause audio feedback. The guards froze. Crosby didn't look back. He kept rubbing the boy's chest, feeling the necrotic skin peeling away under his rough canvas glove like wet paper. "Come on," Crosby whispered, his own heart hammering fiercely against his newly healed collarbone. A bead of sweat dripped from Crosby's nose and splashed directly onto Arthur's cheek. Then Arthur gagged. It wasn't a cough. It was a brutal, full-body convulsion. The boy arched in the gravity harness, his spine bowing backward so sharply it looked like it might snap. A horrific sound tore from Arthur's throat, a wet, tearing gasp that sprayed a mist of dark, blackish fluid into the air. Crosby didn't flinch. He didn't step back to protect himself from the biological spray. He just grabbed the back of the boy's neck, supporting his head, as Arthur vomited a thick, necrotic bile down the front of Crosby's royal-issued tunic. The stench was unbearable. It smelled like sulfur and rotting meat. "He is hemorrhaging!" Linus shrieked. "No, he's purging!" Crosby yelled back, coughing against the foul smell. Beneath his hands, the boy's skin was suddenly, violently hot. The heat didn't bloom slowly. It ignited like a chemical fire. The violet flush hit Arthur's neck, racing up his jawline and flooding his cheeks. His pulse, previously a sluggish drag, erupted into a frantic, terrifying sprint. The veins on the boy's temples bulged, glowing a furious, blinding purple. Arthur's eyes snapped open. The murky grey was gone, replaced by a deep, swirling magenta, completely dilated by terror and pain. The boy let out a high, harmonic scream that shattered a glass beaker on Linus's workstation. "Ice!" Crosby roared, struggling to hold the thrashing child steady in the harness. Arthur's fingernails clawed blindly at Crosby's arms, drawing long, thin lines of blood. "Get the gel blocks. Pack him down." The guards dropped their rifles and sprinted for the supply lockers. Linus stood frozen, his pupilless eyes wide with shock at the sheer violence of the biological reaction. The sterile order of his laboratory was completely ruined, covered in sweat, blood, and the expelled rot of the boy's lungs. The next 20 minutes were a grueling, physical brawl. Arthur's body fought a brutal civil war. His temperature spiked so high his tears turned to steam on his cheeks. Crosby didn't let go. He held the boy's hands, whispering hoarse, meaningless curses and encouragements, keeping Arthur grounded in reality while the fever tried to cook his brain. When the break finally came, it was sudden. Arthur's chest heaved with one massive, clear intake of air. The frantic thrashing ceased. The terrifying heat radiating from his skin evaporated, replaced by a cool, damp sweat. His head dropped onto Crosby's shoulder, smearing more black fluid against the ruined silver threads of the tunic. The erratic shrieking of the monitors fell into a low, steady, rhythmic chime. Crosby stood there, supporting the boy's limp weight. His own legs were shaking violently. He breathed in the awful, ruined air of the laboratory, staring blankly at the wall. "He's asleep," Crosby rasped. His throat was raw. He carefully unclasped the boy's rigid fingers from his own sleeve and stepped back. Linus approached slowly, holding a scanner with trembling hands. He passed it over Arthur's chest. The alien physician looked at the readout, then looked up at Crosby. "The rot is gone," Linus whispered. "Complete eradication." Crosby wiped a streak of sweat and necrotic bile from his forehead with the back of his hand. He didn't feel victorious. He just felt deeply, profoundly tired. He turned and looked up at the observation gallery. Arian was standing with both hands pressed flat against the glass, his shoulders slumped in absolute relief. Crosby gave the king a slow, cynical nod, then turned and walked toward the heavy lab doors. He needed a drink, and he needed his own clothes. Heavy boots echoed down the curving, pristine corridor. 2 weeks had passed since the incident in the laboratory, and Crosby had finally managed to negotiate the terms of his indentured servitude. He pushed open the heavy double doors at the end of the hall. The air inside the room hit him like a physical blow. It smelled gloriously of heavy machine grease, ozone, and burnt synthetic coffee. The Royal Engineers had been horrified, but King Arian had strictly enforced Crosby's demands. They had converted a secondary shuttle bay into a perfect replica of a lower-deck maintenance shop. There were scattered piles of stripped engine cowlings, a massive grease-stained workbench, and a ventilation system intentionally calibrated to filter out only 50% of the ambient particulate matter. Crosby sat on an overturned chemical bucket, running a dirty rag over a heavy pneumatic wrench. He wore a patched, heavy canvas jumpsuit. He hadn't washed his hair in 4 days. The pneumatic doors hissed open behind him. The sound of light footsteps against the metal grating announced his visitor. Crosby didn't turn around. "You shouldn't be in here, Princess. The air quality is atrocious. I explicitly told the foreman to leave the carbon exhaust running on the generator." Gaynor stopped a few feet away. She was wearing a simple, dark gown today, devoid of the royal mercury silk. She looked around the cluttered, filthy bay with a mixture of intense curiosity and mild disgust. "My father says you refused the royal quarters," she said. Her voice, filtered through the translator, still carried that soft, melodic cadence. "The pillows were too soft," Crosby muttered, tightening a bolt on the wrench. "And the air smelled like a hospital. If you want me to keep producing the aggressive microflora that cures your people, you can't keep me in a sterile box. I need dirt, I need stress, I need bad food and physical labor." He turned to look at her. She looked entirely healthy. The glowing veins on her ivory skin pulsed with a calm, steady rhythm. "So I fix your broken shuttles," Crosby continued, gesturing with the wrench to the dismantled transport skiff in the corner. "I get my hands dirty. I drink coffee that tastes like battery acid. And twice a week, Linus sends down whoever in the sector has caught the rot, and I hold their hand for a few hours. That's the deal." Gaynor crossed her arms over her chest. "You are a prisoner, Crosby Miller. Yet you have forced the sovereign king to build you a shrine of filth." Crosby snorted, a dry, humorless sound. "I'm a battery princess. I'm just making sure I don't lose my charge." He tossed the dirty rag onto the workbench and stood up. He walked over to a small, battered terminal, mounted on the wall, and tapped the cracked screen. A grainy, delayed video feed flickered to life. It showed a bustling, cramped colony dome on Mars. "Besides," Crosby said, his voice softening just a fraction. Arian agreed to my price. My hazard pay is being routed directly to my sister. She just bought a seat on the executive council of her sector. She doesn't have to breathe recycled exhaust anymore. Gaynor stepped closer, looking at the grainy image on the screen. She watched the chaotic, crowded human settlement, the dirt roads, and the heavy smog hanging in the artificial atmosphere. Your world is chaotic, she observed quietly. It's a mess, Crosby agreed. He picked up his mug of tepid, bitter coffee and took a long sip. But it fights back. Gaynor turned her magenta eyes toward him. There was no royal superiority in her gaze anymore, only a quiet, grounded understanding. She reached out, her long, multi-jointed fingers slowly bridging the gap between them. She didn't hesitate before resting her hand lightly against his grease-stained sleeve. "Thank you," she said softly. Crosby looked at her hand, then up at her face. The cynical armor he wore slipped just a fraction, revealing the exhausted, deeply human mechanic underneath. He didn't pull away. "Don't mention it," Crosby said, his voice rough. "Just don't touch the workbench. I finally got the grime perfectly layered." Gaynor's eyes narrowed slightly, the closest her species could come to a smile. She dropped her hand and stepped back toward the pristine corridor outside. As the heavy doors hissed shut, sealing him back in his curated sanctuary of dirt and noise, Crosby let out a long breath. He picked up his wrench, feeling the familiar, heavy weight of the iron in his grip. The galaxy was vast, sterile, and terrifyingly fragile. But as long as engines broke and royalty kept getting sick, the mechanic always had a job. He wiped a streak of grease across his forehead, turned up the heavy bass of his music player, and went back to work. If you loved this story about humanity's messy, relentless resilience, smash that like button. We post original, gritty sci-fi dramas every single week, bringing you grounded tales where humans don't just survive. We fight back with everything we've got. Don't miss out on the next adventure. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you're always the first to hear our new releases. Share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans and let me know in the comments, what's the dirtiest job you've ever had to do to survive? Keep fighting, and see you next time.